That's what I had in mind when I clocked in for my shift at the small corner store in Las Vegas. When you work the night shift at a convenience store, you expect things to be fairly normal, maybe a few customers trying to buy beer after hours and occasionally a rowdy group returning from the strip. I like the quiet, honestly. There's a rhythm to the night shift, stocking shelves, sweeping the floor, and waiting for the occasional customer. Around 1 a.m., I always kept the radio on low for company, a familiar sound that prevented the silence from feeling too overwhelming. Most people were winding down for the night, but my shift was just getting started. I was at the counter flipping through a magazine when I noticed them, two men standing under the streetlight just outside the store, their shadows stretching long across the pavement. They weren't doing anything at first, just standing there talking quietly. I told myself it was nothing, people hang around all the time waiting for rides or just killing time. But something about the way they kept looking toward the store set off a small alarm in my mind. After a few minutes, one of them pointed in my direction. I quickly looked away, pretending to be engrossed in the magazine, but my pulse was picking up. When I looked back, they were gone, or so I thought. Not 2 minutes later, the bell above the door jingled and the two men walked in. They moved slowly, their eyes scanning the store like they were casing the place. One was tall and wiry with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. The other was shorter, stocky, and wearing a hoodie that obscured most of his features. Evening, I said, trying to sound friendly. They didn't respond. Instead, they split up, each wandering down different aisles. The tall one pretended to browse the snacks, while the shorter one headed toward the drinks cooler. I stayed behind the counter watching them carefully. Something about their movements felt calculated, like they weren't here to shop. The shorter guy was the first to approach the counter. He slapped a can of soda down and leaned in close. Slow night, huh? He said. Yeah, I replied, ringing up the soda. Pretty quiet. He by yourself? He asked, his eyes darting around the store. The question rattled me, catching me off guard. My coworkers in the back, I lied, gesturing toward the stockroom door. He raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. Instead, he looked over his shoulder at his friend, who was now lingering near the exit. Mind if I use your restroom? He asked. Sorry, it's employees only. He didn't like that. His expression tightened, and for a moment I thought he was going to argue, but then he just smirked and stepped back, joining his friend near the door. As I watched them whisper to each other, my unease grew. Something wasn't right. I reached under the counter and pressed the button for the silent alarm, a precaution we were trained to use if anything felt off. The taller guy suddenly walked back toward me, his hands in his pockets. Hey, do you sell phone chargers? He asked. There by the register, I said, gesturing to a small display. As he leaned over to look, I noticed his other hand slipping out of his pocket and holding a padlock. Before I could react, he walked over to the door and passed a small chain through the doorknobs and locked the padlock with a loud click. What are you doing? I demanded. Relax, he said, grinning. We just want to talk. My heart was racing. Now they had locked me in. The shorter guy moved closer to the counter, blocking my path to the stockroom. Look, I said, if you're not buying anything, you need to leave. We're not leaving. The taller, while they were preoccupied, I reached beneath the counter and grabbed the panic button, which activated the alarm that would send a direct signal to the police. One of them remarked, his smile growing, not until we're done. I didn't wait to find out what done meant. The sound reverberated through the walls, deafening. Both men stopped when the shorter guy yelled, but I didn't give them time to react. I took the pepper spray from beneath the counter and pointed it at the taller one, who hesitated for a second before grabbing the key and unlocking the door. I then ran as quickly as I could into the parking lot behind me. I heard glass breaking, and they started smashing the windows out of frustration. I kept running until I got to the gas station down the street, where I hastily narrated what had happened, glass flying everywhere. When the officers arrived, the men had left a lot of evidence behind, including broken glass, bolt cutters they had dropped, and even the small chain, padlock, and key they had used to lock the door. The clerk had called the police, and within minutes patrol cars were speeding toward the convenience store. My nagging dread persisted even after the police received my statement and promised to use every resource at their disposal to locate the individuals. Shortly after I realized that no amount of money was worth feeling so exposed, I quit my work. I appreciate the training that helped me remain composed and quick thinking, but the experience taught me a hard lesson. Even in the most routine situations, danger can happen at any time. Being a nurse was hard, but I loved what I did. Helping people in even the most trying circumstances made every long shift worthwhile at the end of the day. Even though I was typically that July night, running on empty, began like any other, with me leaving the hospital late and fatigued but relieved that the shift was done. What transpired next is something I will always remember. The hospital was eerily quiet at that hour, with most of the lights dimmed and the halls empty save for a few night shift workers. I left work just after midnight, threw my bag over my shoulder, and made my way to the parking lot. The parking lot wasn't much better, with only a few lamps scattered about, creating long, distorted shadows. My car was parked near the far edge of the lot, a spot I regretted choosing every time I worked a late shift. As I stepped outside, the warm, sticky air hit me like a wall. The Florida summers had a way of clinging to you. I walked briskly, the rhythmic clink of my keys in my hand breaking the silence. About halfway to my car, I noticed him. At first he seemed unremarkable, a man in his mid-30s wearing a baseball cap and a loose hoodie. Standing near one of the lampposts, he was pacing back and forth, and something about his movements felt off. They were too erratic, like he was working himself up for something. I kept walking, quickening my pace as my instincts kicked in. I looked around the lot hoping to see someone else, anyone, but it was just me and him. He noticed me. I could feel his eyes on me, tracking my every step. When I reached my car, I tried to unlock the door as quickly as possible. "Excuse me," he called, his voice loud in the silence. I froze, my hand hovering over the door handle. "Hey, can you help me out?" he said, stepping closer. "I'm trying to find Main Street. Do you know where it is?" He seemed friendly, but there was something forced about the way he spoke. I turned slightly, keeping my distance. "Sorry, I'm not sure." "That's okay," he said, taking another step toward me. "Maybe you could check on your phone." I shook my head and said, "I'm sorry, but I can't help you." His body language changed, and his friendliness was replaced by something more predatory. "Come on," he said, his voice hardening. "It will only take a second." I took a step back, my heart pounding, and I said, "No," repeating louder this time. He stopped, staring into my eyes with an uncomfortable intensity. "Why are you being like this?" he asked in a tone that was almost mocking. I didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. Instead, I tightened my grip on my keys, holding them between my fingers like a makeshift weapon, and Sid moved toward the back of my car. "I don't want any more trouble," I said. "You don't have to make this difficult," and he stepped forward once more. I was desperately searching the lot for an escape route, and my car was my best option, but he was too close. Then, without thinking, I hit the panic button on my car's key fob, and the alarm went off loudly throughout the empty parking lot. The man flinched, startled, and I took advantage of the situation to dart around the car and open the driver's side door. As I slid inside, he lunged toward me, his hand slamming against the window. I didn't hesitate. I started the engine, shifted into gear, and floored it for a terrifying moment. I thought he was going to follow me on foot, but he was gone when I turned onto the main road. I looked in the rearview mirror, and he was gone, but my hands were shaking, and my mind was racing with what might have happened if I hadn't acted quickly. I contacted the cops after pulling into a petrol station a few miles away. When the dispatcher asked me to describe the man and what had happened, she said, "Are you safe now?" I said, "Yes," but I wasn't sure if I believed it. The police never located him, so they said it was probably a random predator looking for an opportunity, but that didn't console me. For weeks, I was plagued by the thought that he was still out there, and going to my car became a stressful ritual. That night transformed me as my eyes searched the darkness while I gripped my keys as though for safety. I've been a night security guard for almost 10 years, and while I like to think I'm good at my job, most nights are uneventful. I used to think I was cautiously aware of my surroundings, but now I realize how quickly things can go wrong. If there's one thing I've learned, it's to act immediately if something doesn't feel right, because it might save your life. I've always felt confident in my ability to handle any situation that comes my way, but one night last month that confidence was shaken in a way I'll never forget. The construction site I was assigned to was an enormous area littered with steel beams, heavy machinery, and half-finished buildings. It was a cold night for Jacksonville, the kind that made my breath fog up as I walked my rounds. The site was quiet as usual, and my flashlight illuminated the darkness as I made my way through the property paperwork and maybe spied a stray raccoon looking through the trash. Sure that everything was in place at the equipment yard I prefer to maintain it consistent, I was halfway through my shift when I noticed something odd. A section of the chain link fence near the back of the yard was slightly bent, as if someone had tried to pull it open. I went over to inspect it. The damage wasn't extensive, but it was recent. I would have noticed it during my earlier rounds. Nevertheless, I made a note to report it to my supervisor and carried on with my patrol. An hour later, I was passing the equipment yard once more when I noticed a figure standing near one of TH. I moved closer, shining the flashlight directly at him, but as soon as the beam struck, he ran behind the excavator and vanished into the shadows. I yelled, my heart racing, and I jogged towards the location. When I turned the corner, no one was there, but I discovered something that made my stomach turn: a pair of bolt cutters and a knife. The bolt cutters were normal enough, but the knife was dangerous. Its blade gleamed under the flashlight and didn't seem like something you'd use for casual W. Since I hadn't seen the man leave the construction site, every creak of metal made me turn around in the hopes of seeing someone standing there. The following night, I returned to the site with a heightened sense of alertness as I passed the same location where I'd seen the figure, scanning the shadows. The remainder of the night passed without any problems, but the unsettling feeling that I was being watched persisted. My flashlight lingering on every corner. That's when I noticed something new: footprints in the dirt leading away from the fence and toward the unfinished building at the edge of the site. I followed them cautiously, my hand resting on a pepper spray clip to my belt. The prints were heading towards the building's entrance, but I found no one. It was around 3 a.m. When I saw the figure again, this time they were standing near the site's main office trailer. I didn't hesitate, gripping my flashlight tightly. I approached the trailer, calling out, I see you. Step out. No response. When I reached the trailer, I pushed the door open only to find it empty. The air inside was stale and the faint smell of cigarettes was unmistakable. Someone had been there recently. I stepped outside, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The trespasser was nowhere to be seen. Over the next few nights, things only got worse. Tools started going missing, and I found more signs of someone sneaking onto the property: discarded food wrappers, cigarette butts, even a makeshift bedroll hidden behind a stack of wooden pallets. But the most unsettling part was the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I walked past the equipment yard, I felt eyes on me. It was as if the trespasser wasn't just trying to steal. They were observing me, studying my routine. On the fifth night, I decided to set a trap. I placed a motion sensor near the equipment yard and positioned myself in a spot where I could watch without being seen. It was past midnight when the sensor went off. Its sharp beep echoed through the silence. I grabbed my FL flashlight and moved quickly but quietly toward the yard. There he was, the same figure crouched near one of the excavators. This time I didn't call out. I crept closer, my flashlight off until I was just a few feet away. Gotcha, I said, switching on the light. The figure spun around, his face hidden under the shadow of a hoodie. For a moment we stared at each other, and I saw something in their eyes that made my blood run cold. Pure malice. Before I could react, he bolted, disappearing into the darkness. I called the police right away, and they came a short while later. We searched the area, but the only evidence the trespasser left was a small rusted key, which the officers took as proof. My supervisor then stepped up security, installed cameras, and hired a second guard for the night shift. Occasionally, while I'm by myself in my current job as a security guard, I notice myself looking about in the shadows. I will never undervalue the risks of working the night shift again, that much is certain. It's hard labor, but there's something soothing about the regularity, the quiet nights beneath the stars, and the early mornings. Farming in Des Moines is about as simple as life can get. Before September of last year, I had assumed that I knew the rhythms of the farm like the back of my hand because I had been working there for 3 years. However, what transpired that day caused me to reevaluate everything I had assumed about it. The sun had just set, and the air carried the unmistakable scent of freshly harvested corn filled the air as I walked along the dirt path with my torch. My boss had asked me to stay late to check on the aeration system in the far field, and the walk wasn't far, but under the cover of darkness, the cornfield took on a different character. The tall stalks swayed with the breeze, their rustling leaves creating an eerie backdrop to the otherwise still night. At first, I thought it was just a horse that had gotten loose from the stall and ended up and all the way to the irrigation pump. The cacophony followed me. I tried to ignore it, blaming it on the wind or animals, but as my uneasiness grew, I made the decision to look more closely. I left the path and entered the field, the torch casting eerie shadows around me as I pushed through the stalks. For a moment, I thought I was being swallowed by the field. I called out, sounding smaller than I had anticipated, "Hello," but there was no response, just the wind and the steady rustle of the corn. As my torch continued to sweep the rows as I continued to move farther into the field, I noticed something tall and dark scurrying between the stalks, just out of reach of the light. Whatever it was, I paused when my breath caught because it was too tall and too human. When I returned to the main path, the rustling had stopped, and the field was once more calm, but this time it was a strange, heavy silence. I had retreated out of the field, my torch trembling in my hand. I didn't stay to learn more, so I hurried back to the barn to lock up for the night and go home. The following night, I told myself it had been nothing more than a long day in my wild imagination, but when my boss asked me to check the far field once more, I hesitated. "Yeah, just tired," he said, armed with my torch and a little more. Decided, I set out once more. The night was eerily similar to the one before, the same swaying stalks, the same oppressive quiet, but this time I wasn't alone for long. As I walked along the path, I felt it again, that nagging sensation of being watched. I stopped and turned, sweeping the flashlight across the field. That's when I saw the same shadowy figure standing motionless about 20 feet away, just beyond the first row of corn. "Hey," I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. "You're trespassing. This is private property." The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, the flashlight trained on the spot where it stood, but as soon as the beam touched it, the figure disappeared, melting into the shadows like it had never been there. The sightings continued over the next few nights, each one more unsettling than the last. The figure always appeared in the same general area, never making a sound, never coming closer. It felt like a game when I wasn't sure I wanted to play. By the fourth night I'd had enough. I decided to investigate during the day, thinking maybe I'd find tracks or some other explanation for what I'd been seeing in the daytime. The cornfield was silent. Standing tall and unassuming, I noticed something odd as I made my way to the spot where I'd seen the figure. The stalks in that area were flattened, as if someone or something had been there for a long time. I knelt down to examine the ground and discovered footprints, human but larger than any I'd ever seen, deeper into the field, vanishing into the rows of corn. That night, when my boss called to ask me to stay late again, I couldn't refuse. I walked to the field, clutching my torch tightly. I told my boss about the sightings the following day, but he didn't seem concerned. He shrugged and said, "Probably just a drifter," but I knew that whatever I'd seen wasn't normal. I haven't worked at the farm since last autumn, but every time I drive past a cornfield, I catch myself looking through the rows, expecting to see that shadow again. If these stories kept you on the edge of your seat, hit the like button and share this video with your friends who enjoy a good scare. Don't forget to please leave a comment. We would love to highlight it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare. Be careful out there, and keep in mind that sometimes what you should be afraid of isn't the darkness,